The topic we're going to cover today is creating trust with client journey maps. And we're really going to talk about two elements of that. The first is the part of creating trust. What does that mean? Why is that important? And the second part is developing an elementary understanding of what a client journey map is and how they work. And what I'm going to do today is try to show you a very simple, straightforward way to start the process of journey mapping so you can reap the benefits of creating trust and building more positive experiences with your clients. The loyalist and researcher James Kane, he says very eloquently, really what people are hiring you to do is three things. You're going to make my life easier. And if you make my life easier, boy, that's delightful. We live in a very complex world. Life is hard. You make my life easier. That's delightful. You make my life safer. That's really where this trust equation comes in. I'm hiring you because I want you to make my life safer. I want you to take away risk. I want you to make me look good. I want you to make sure I don't fail at something that's important to me. And I hire you to make my life better. That somehow at the end of our interaction, I will be at an improved state because of your contribution to my status, my welfare as an individual, as a client, as a politician, as a business person, whatever my world is. Easier and safer are the ones that we most commonly focus on. That better threshold is a more difficult and a more stringent a threshold to get over. And again, going through the process of journey mapping helps us identify friction points, risk points, and the emotional state so we can drive towards the betterness at the end of the journey. We've all had that project we've worked on where, you know what, if someone asked me in a job interview about the best project I ever did, I know what story I'm going to tell. How do we have that kind of experience every time? And the more we can consistently deliver that kind of experience, the more we're able to build on that trust equation with our clients, that they trust us to deliver that experience all the time. It's not accidental or haphazard or random chance, but we've developed processes and protocols and people to deliver that experience consistently. And in order to get there, we really have to think through the desired future state. We can't achieve that level of best project ever if we don't begin with that end in mind. So tip number one, when you start an engagement with a client, when you begin pursuing a new client, take a moment and just write down, what is your desired future state? And that's your desired future state for you, your desired future state for your firm, and the desired future state for your client. And if you do nothing else, this is really kind of a microscopic piece of anticipating and designing a journey. Put a point on the map and say, that's where I want to be. You can't have a journey if you don't have a destination. And it's amazing how many opportunities we miss to do great things because we never stopped long enough to put a pin on the map and say, this is where we want to be. And if you put that pin on the map, you can organize all of your efforts and the efforts of all those around you and constantly point to that pin and say, see, guys, this is where we all want to be. And with that common destination in mind, you kind of automatically start heading in that direction. And you might take some wrong turns along the way, but you always have that beacon. You got that pin on the map to guide you back on course. Now, a good, clear journey map will help keep you on the straight and narrow so you get to that destination as quickly and efficiently as possible without any of the wrong turns. But the journey map doesn't help if you don't have that destination planned out. So begin with that end in mind. Put that pin on the map. And that pin really comes into, how are you focusing? Are you focused on the project? Or are you really focused on the goals and the mission of the organizations involved? And when you start with that end in mind, you kind of build that framework. Now you can set and measure expectations along the way. You now have a common language. You've got a place you can all talk about. Here's where we're going. And anywhere along the way, if something comes up, something unexpected, or someone on the team, one of the stakeholders starts pulling you off course, you got a great tool to point back and say, remember, we set the expectations up front that this is where we want to be. Now, we can be flexible, and if we as a team, got some new information, and really there's a different place we all want to be, and we agree on that together, let's go over there. So you're constantly setting those expectations of where success is, where is the destination, and then you're measuring along the way, where are you? And this really is setting those expectations around making life easier for each of the stakeholders, making life safer, and making life better. It's also imperative in the trust equation that you not have any surprises. Surprises erode trust. And when you map out a journey and you really understand the journey fully, you're going to see all the places where the client might be surprised, and you're going to be able to mitigate and work around those. And I've got an example of how to do that. I'll show you when we build out the journey map. Now, when we talk about building a journey map, we need to know who the stakeholders are, because these journeys are client journeys. They are journeys of the different stakeholders. And from that, it's going to be important to build a map sensitive to each of those individuals. And one of the things I recommend is building a persona for each of your key stakeholders, at least for your client. So in the persona, you might write who. Well, I'm doing a map for Bob. And what is Bob's role? Bob's the executive VP, and he's the key decision maker on this project. What is Bob's goal? What is Bob hoping to accomplish? And that's kind of an organizational question, but it's also kind of a personal question. So Bob has some goals that we're going to capture and make sure we stay focused on. What do we know about the company? Tell me about the company. Well, he works at Acme, and here's some things about Acme. Decisions. This isn't what decisions need to be made. This is how does Bob make decisions? How does Acme make decisions? Just filling in this one box right here, if you take a minute to diagnose how one of your clients makes decisions, I guarantee you're going to learn something powerful about how to interact with them when you receive new information and need to get information from them. And then what are his values? And it's always tough to fully understand someone else's values, but their behavior oftentimes gives you a lot of clues. And just write down a couple of values. And some of those are going to be do's. And now you can be intentional about doing those things when working with Bob. And some of those will be don'ts. And so it'll be important to not do those things when working with Bob. And this becomes a little bit of a map of how to interact effectively with Bob you can share with your team. If you skip the persona step, you risk missing some important intelligence when you build out your map. Moving on to how do you pick a journey to map? And critical moments of truth are the places on the journey where the client has something big happen. Either there's a major decision that has to be made, anytime there's a signature required on something, whether it's signing a contract or signing an invoice or signing a check, anytime there's a formal review, anytime there's a commonplace things go haywire, those are critical moments of truth. And because of the criticality of those become good opportunities to prioritize, let's map this journey. Key processes are another you might want to look at journey mapping. Even if you have a process map for the process, you got a good head start. Let's take that process map, which is probably very internally focused, and run it through the journey map lens. So now you can understand how that process impacts all of the other stakeholders externally as well as internally. And then common phases. If there's things you do all the time, journey map those. If you find one thing that makes that common phase better, and you do that common thing 500 times a year as a company, boy, all of a sudden that map has some real high value because you just made 500 projects that much better. So look for critical moments of truth, key processes, common phases. Those are good elements to break down into a journey. So what are the elements of a journey map? And there's no real right answer on this. Some common elements are touch points. Touch points are where two people are interacting in some way. So touch points are interactions. Steps, if you want to break things down by step, if you're more of a process, a thinking person, capturing steps. Collateral, what are the documents and the resources that are needed at this phase in the journey? Deliverables, you're creating, I know most of you are information workers, you're not delivering a product, you're delivering a drawing or a report or a contract, some kind of thing that captures a bunch of intellectual knowledge to represent the deliverable. So those deliverables may play a key role in the journey. Systems, tools, you've got software, you've got hardware, you have all these other systems that play that very much impact the journey. Emotions need to be captured to effectively understand the journey. And scorecards, what different elements exist, and if we were to score those in some way, what does that scorecard look like? So here's the map that I've laid out. For this example, I'm talking about the invoice journey. So you see I've got that listed over on the right-hand side. And just a really simple table. The first row is the step. You know, I'm going with steps. You could do interactions, you could do touch points, whatever is most important for you. The invoice journey really is kind of a process plus. So I'm going with steps rather than interactions. Then there's a swim lane here for the client, and the client interactions live in this swim lane. There's a swim lane for us. The things that I do or that my firm does, they live in this swim lane. So I've got a swim lane for the key actors. I've got boxes here up at the top for step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. And then I got some documents because I know, gosh, the invoice journey, kind of the key part of the invoice journey is a document. So we're going to talk about some documents that happen down here. And then there's some systems that are required to make this process work. So what you need to do is, when you're laying out your journey, figure out how many rows do you need. In this case, it's a fairly simple 5-row system. And then how many columns do you need? And that columns is really going to be dependent on the number of steps. I recommend using Post-it notes on the wall because you can pull them off and move them down and insert new Post-it notes if you need to. Don't be super neat with it. If you keep putting up Post-it notes real close together, side by side by side, there's no room to insert additional steps. So I'd go ahead and build in some space. If you're going to be doing Post-it notes, do a Post-it here, do a Post-it here, do a Post-it here. So if you miss something, you can come back in and throw some new Post-it notes in without having to move a bunch of stuff around. So looking at the steps of the invoice journey, we're going to send the invoice as step 1. Review the invoice. Maybe someone has to ask a question. We got to send some backup, and we got to approve. Here's another element. When you are mapping out your journey, don't necessarily map out the best case scenario. The best case scenario probably can't be improved all that much. Map out maybe a scenario where there's a flaw. Clearly, this step here, ask a question, means we didn't get the invoice right. And we probably constantly deal with clients calling us, asking us a question about the invoice. So it's not like we're mapping a one-time exception. We're mapping kind of a common situation here. We're mapping the invoice journey where the invoice as delivered isn't good enough. Oh, that probably relates. We probably have a lot of those, don't we? We don't want to map the best case scenario. Let's map the scenario we want to improve. So beyond that, now we need to look at the stakeholders. And here's where it starts looking a little map-like. So maybe there's somebody in accounts receivable or billing who generates an invoice, and they send that invoice to somebody in accounts payable. So it goes from our swim lane up to the client swim lane. And now in this client swim lane, the accounts payable person sends it over to the project manager, who's now in the review step. Reviewing it, now we go to the ask question step. The project manager at the client asks a question of me, the project manager in my firm. And now I move over to a step where I have to generate some backup, generate a report or some justification to answer this question. So now I have to send that over to the project manager on that side, and then he moves over, approves it, and sends it to account payables for payment. See all those steps along the way? We're kind of moving up and down between the swim lanes. You could get really fancy and have different swim lanes for the AP person and the project manager. It makes the map look a little bit neater, but I was trying to keep it simple here for these purposes. So we got a map now. Here's the interactions. Here's where something is happening. In this case, it's kind of a document flow. So again, it's a simpler process to look at. And then we got to think about, what are the documents? What are the collateral or resources that make this process happen aside from the people? Well, we need an invoice, and the invoice happens in step 1. The invoice happens in step 2. There's not really any collateral that happens here in step 3. I need to send a report in step 4. That's that document with all the backup. So there's another piece of collateral that needs to happen. And then we have the invoice and report. So we have both pieces of collateral coming together at the end. And the reason why it's important to map out these documents and resources is we begin to see, you know what? If we just did this invoice and report here in step 1, we would have been able to skip steps 3 and step 4. This step and this step we won't even have to do. So that's how the map helps you start figuring out ways you can make the whole process better. And then we look at our systems. There's the billing system, there's email, we have our ERP system. Maybe I need to go into the project management system to get backup to support the invoice that came out of the billing system. The email's involved again. So looking at those systems, that can also be helpful, particularly if you're dealing with a lot of technical documents going back and forth. There may be compatibility issues, other things like that. So the more high tech you are, the more digital your business is, the more important clearly mapping out those systems and tools becomes. So a fairly simple map here, 5 basic steps. We've got the 5 lanes, kind of a 5x5 grid, not too complicated. We're able to put this together in 5 minutes. Journey maps don't have to be hard. But now we want to take it a little bit further. What if we look at the emotional state of the client across the journey? And now we can draw in a line. I like to use a highlighter. Draw in a line. What is the emotional state? And pick somewhere that is your status quo, kind of our beginning emotional state. I don't really have any feelings one way or the other, but I get the invoice and my emotional state goes downward. It's negative. I'm feeling confused. So I ask a question, and I go from confused to impatient, and it's taking time to get my question answered. So I'm getting all the way down to frustrated. And now we can see, oh boy, look, the lag time, as soon as the question is asked until the question is answered, there is a declining emotional state every time. Well, that helps inform. We want to either avoid that altogether, or if you can't avoid it, figure out how to close that gap as much as possible. Finally, I respond to the client. I don't just answer the question, but I give maybe even better information than expected. There's this problem of like trying to figure out how to deal with this invoice has taken care of. What a sigh of relief. I go right back to the status quo emotional state. Some journeys, your client's going to end on a higher emotional state. You're going to leave the journey feeling great. You're going to leave the journey feeling really frustrated. You don't always come back to that status quo. So in this case, I kind of left I started in the middle for a reason and kind of went up and down from there, but map out that emotional journey. Now, clearly, there's some elements in this emotional journey we don't really like. We don't want the client to feel confused, impatient, or frustrated. So let's go back to optimizing the journey. If we just sent this invoice and report up front, we could skip steps 3 and 4. And in fact, step 2, reviewing the invoice, we avoid that confusion altogether. So really, the desired future state, do you remember that slide? I said, let's talk about the desired future state. Let me come back to the exclamation part for a sec. Before we go to desired future state, I forgot the step, sorry. Flag any areas that create effort for your client. Where does the client have unusual effort? So there's the emotional state, and there's also the effort state. Where does the client have to put in effort? If you remember, we also said earlier, let's make my life easier, safer, and better. So if there's some effort here reviewing the invoice, that's another place we can look. What's going on right here that's causing the client to have to put in a lot of effort? What can we do to make it easier? So we've looked at the emotional journey. We've looked at the places where there's high effort. And now we can define what's the emotional journey we want to have. We want to start status quo, and when we deliver the invoice, the emotional response to go up. That's kind of counterintuitive. People don't really think about, the moment I receive an invoice, I should be happier. But if we really think about it from the client's perspective, and we do this map, I've got this line dotted here because we can skip that whole part of the journey. If we deliver the right invoice the right way and make it as easy as possible for the client to approve, instead of going through this whole negative valley of emotion before saving it a little bit and coming out back to status quo, we can deliver an invoice, jump up. When everyone else is causing pain and you're causing delight, you stand out. And by looking different like that, you don't come back down to status quo. You walk out of there with some lingering goodwill that lingers over into their selection for the next project. So this becomes your journey map. It's not complicated. It can be if you try to map out too much. If you try to bite off more than you can chew, it can get hard real fast. Instead, keep it simple. Do 1 or 2 of these. It shouldn't take you all that long to map out a simple journey. Now, it can get more complex. And when you start looking at complexity, there's 2 ways to address the complexity. Clearly, some of your journeys have a lot more steps than 5 steps, and that just adds complexity because they're longer. I don't think I have to talk about that. You can extrapolate length of the journey. I want to talk about the vertical axis, adding additional rows to the journey. And when you talk about the vertical rows, you really want to look at the value chain. So your firm is part of the value chain. You're kind of sitting right in here. And value always goes opposite of money. Value creation goes opposite of where the dollars flow. So you hire vendors to create value for you. You pay them. Your client hires you to create value for the client, and the client pays you. So there's always these opposing flows of value and exchange for value. And if you map out that value chain, here's my firm, here's my client, maybe the client has someone consuming his or her services, and that consumer of those services has an end user. So think about it this way. I'm a structural engineer, and maybe that's me, and I've got an architect here who's hired me to do the structural engineering, and the architect's client is an owner who's designing a new, or who needs a new dorm for a university, and the users those might be the students, those might be the facilities people, there's all kinds of other people that might be users. So there's a whole value chain that exists here. And the deeper you go in the value chain when building your map, the more opportunity you have to create additional value for your client. Some of the biggest value you can create for your client is to help your client create value for his client. So level 1 thinking, client, I'm going to create value for you. Level 2 thinking, client, I'm going to help you create value for your client. That's an incredible trust building exercise when you help your clients create value for their clients. And then step into that mindset, and you're now thinking win-win-win. This goes back to what I talked about at the beginning. You're putting that pin on the map. What does success look like for everybody? How does delivering this project help everybody achieve their organizational goals, mission, objectives, purpose? And if you're the champion, it doesn't matter where you are in the value chain. If you act like the champion for negotiating the win-win-win outcome, you're creating value for everybody. You're creating trust for everybody. And here's where it can get a little more complicated. So here's a journey, but notice instead of all the processes and documents and systems, I've got the user, I've got the consumer, I've got the client, I've got 4 rows just for the stakeholders. There's more rows under this that just don't show up on the screen. I've just added additional rows. In the map I used as an example, we had these first 2 rows. Now I've added 2 additional rows to this map. So now when we're tracing these steps, we see there's a user here who passes off something here, who's over here, and we're able to track where this stuff is moving, where all the interactions lie. And each one of those interactions is going to drive different emotional state changes in the journey. So what's happening in the emotional state of the client? And we kind of map that emotional state. And what's happening in the emotional state of my client's client? And what's happening in the emotional state of the end user of whatever it is we're doing? And you start mapping those out. And really what you're looking for is these emotional state changes where things are going down. What's contributing to those negative emotional state changes? And so you hone in on those things. And now you look down below the line at the systems, the processes, the documents, the tools, all those other rows that you've got on the map. Can any of those contribute to fixing that negative emotional state change? So that's why you map out these journeys. It's not just about the process side of it and optimizing process. It's looking at the emotional overlay so you can find those negative emotional state changes and optimize the emotion as well. And that emotion is strongly corollary to creating positive trust with your clients. And if you just map one thing that you do 100 times a month, even if you only make that one thing a tiny bit better, the value is going to accrue 100 times a month. And you can kind of capture that value and measure it and share your successes with your team, build some excitement around it. And maybe you go map the next micro journey and you start building a practice of designing, mapping, and redesigning your journeys. And it's not something you do and say you're done. This is really just a discipline you do all the time. So hopefully that's taken you through the big picture, the ideas of creating trust. You create that trust by demonstrating understanding. You demonstrate that understanding by mapping out what you know, what you can anticipate, and then even including your client in that mapping process so that they know and they can trust